This image demonstrates the viewpoint of the workers. And I ask, how? It's quite simple. You can see the millions being built on the backs of the workers. So the benefits of economic expansion were distributed highly unevenly. And labor noticed. For a few workers, including skilled workers with some control over production processes such as miners and iron and steel workers, high wages, or reasonably high wages, were the norm. Most industrial workers, however, had semi-skilled jobs that required only managing a machine. These workers had no control over production and were easily replaced and dismissed during a strike or economic downturn. Regular and prolonged unemployment became widespread for these workers, some of whom became tramps, meaning they were taking to the roads and rail to search for employment. Though American workers earned more than their European counterparts, work in the U.S. was more dangerous. Remember that. And because of the high unemployment and use of public and private police, most strikes in America failed. Many workers were extremely poor and relied on family and friends to survive. Class divisions became more visible in this period as more Americans became middle class and very wealthy. The rich began to retreat to their own neighborhoods and build fantastic mansions and estates in the cities and the countryside. A growing number of urban middle-class professionals, office workers, and small businessmen moved to urban and suburban neighborhoods and used new streetcars and commuter railways to get to central business districts. So since transportation had improved, those who had the means could move out of the city center, away from the poor, away from the burgeoning factories, and more uptown. By 1890, the richest 1% of Americans received the same total income as the bottom half of the population and owned more property than the remaining 99%. Many wealthy Americans conspicuously consumed an aristocratic lifestyle of luxury goods, exclusive clubs, colleges, and social events. Not far from the homes of the wealthy were the slums of the urban poor. The difference between the two worlds was captured in Matthew Smith's 1968 bestseller called Sunshine and Shadow in New York, which began with an engraving contrasting a $2 million mansion with the slums. 2 decades later, Jacob Riis published a book of photographs called How the Other Half Lives, documenting the poor's wretched existence in New York City. Now, another change this caused is the overwhelming influence that these wealthy had in our democracy. And that is precisely what this cartoon is arguing. You have the Copper Trust, the Oil Trust, the Iron Trust, and the Steel Trust right behind the backs of the U.S. Senate, controlling what they do, putting a great deal of pressure on them. You can see up here it says, this is a Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, and for the monopolists. And if you remember, that's a play on Abe Lincoln's second inaugural address, where he said, of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, many called these business magnates, quote, robber barons, after German nobles who would charge a toll to pass their castle on the Rhine River in Germany. The business magnates would argue that they were industrial statesmen who do good things like build schools, hospitals, and give to charity. And many did do that. Now, let's talk about William Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt said in an interview with the Chicago Daily News on October 9, 1882, quote, "The railroads are not run for the benefit of the dear public. That cry is all nonsense. They are built by men who invest their money and expect to get a fair percentage on the same." In 1883, when questioned by a reporter about the discontinuance of a fast mail train popular with the public, he declared, "The public be damned! I don't take any stock in this silly nonsense about working for anybody but our own." And he also said, "What do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?" Now let's talk about the gospel of wealth. And this was a term coined by Russell H. Conwell. Now, quote, "I say that you ought to get rich, and it is your duty to get rich. The men who get rich may be the most honest men you find in the community. Let me say here clearly, 98 out of 100 of the rich men of America are honest. That is why they are rich. That is why they are trusted with money. That is why they carry on great enterprises and find plenty of people to work with them. It is because they are honest men. I sympathize with the poor, but the number of poor who are to be sympathized with is very small. To sympathize with a man whom God has punished for his sins is to do wrong. Let us remember, there is not a poor person in the United States who was not made poor by his own shortcomings. So you can see a whole bunch of laissez-faire and social Darwinism in that. Alright, but Russell Conwell brought religion into this equation. And under the gospel of wealth, in that book he wrote, wealth was no longer looked upon as bad. It was viewed as we just read from a quote of his, it was viewed as a sign of God's approval. And he argued it was your Christian duty to accumulate wealth. And, of course, that you should not help the poor. Now we get to Andrew Carnegie's book on wealth. And in this book he argued that the Anglo-Saxon race is superior, that inequality is inevitable and good, and that the wealthy should act as, quote, trustees for their poorer brethren. Now a little bit about Carnegie. By the 1890s, his company, U.S. Steel, was the largest and most profitable industrial enterprise in the world, the Carnegie Steel Company. Carnegie sold it in 1901 for $480 million to J.P. Morgan, the financier we discussed earlier. And he's the one who created U.S. Steel. Carnegie devoted the remainder of his life to large-scale philanthropy, with special emphasis on local libraries, world peace, education, and scientific research. His life has often been referred to as a true rags to riches story. Now, to be sure, he argued you should only help out the people who are willing to help themselves. Now, on the surface, that seems perfectly reasonable. But you need to realize he had a very, very limited view of who you should help. In 1886, the Statue of Liberty, meant to celebrate the friendship between France and the U.S. and the triumph of freedom in the Civil War, was dedicated in New York Harbor. It was France's response to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The statue, which welcomed generations of immigrants to the United States, came to symbolize American freedom. But 1886 also saw one of the greatest waves of strikes and labor protests and violence in the nation's history. Quote, that labor problem. Events which exposed deep social divisions in an industrializing society. The questions of what social conditions enabled freedom and what role the government should play in defining and protecting the rights of citizens took center stage. Now, the final way I will discuss the business world changing is our relative share of world manufacturing. If you look at 1880, we made a little under 15% of the world's stuff. And the largest share, single share, went to Great Britain at almost a quarter of the world's stuff. By 1900, we made almost a quarter of the world's stuff, 23.6%. And England was down to 18.5%. Now, if you go to 1913, that goes up to 32%. By far the largest single share of manufacturing in the world. Even larger than the other category, which means all the other nations bunched together.